Welcome to Psycho Killer, the podcast for true crime lovers everywhere. This time, we have a real-life murder mystery for you.
Or should that be a real death murder mystery?
That's Jack Morrell. He was a murder squad detective for 30 years, and he's seen his share of crime scenes. I'm Pip Watts, a journalist and broadcaster.
And I'm Simon Ford. I'll be your guide through this maze of murder and intrigue. The location is Bayview near Cleveland, Ohio. The scene of the crime is a colonial-style house perched on a cliff top overlooking Lake Eerie. The date is Sunday the 4th of July, 1954. The previous evening, Dr. Sam Shepphard, a 31-year-old neurosurgeon and osteopath, and his wife Marilyn entertained another couple to dinner. Marilyn was 4 months pregnant. Afterwards, with their 7-year-old son Samuel Reese, or Chip as everyone called him, tucked up in bed, the adults watched a movie on TV, and Dr. Sam, as everyone called him, fell asleep on the couch. He'd had a busy day and was likely to be equally busy in the morning because the Sheppards had invited a number of their many friends to an Independence Day barbecue on their lawn. Dr. Sheppard was still asleep when, just after midnight, the other couple left. What happened next is still a matter of conjecture. According to Dr. Sam, he was woken by his wife's screams for help. He ran upstairs to their bedroom where he saw a white form standing over Marilyn's bed. He grappled with the intruder, then a blow from behind knocked him unconscious. When he came round, he found that his pregnant wife had been battered to death by, it was later estimated, 35 blows to the head with a heavy instrument. He ran into his son's bedroom. Samuel Reese was unharmed and fast asleep. Then, hearing a noise from the ground floor, he dashed downstairs where he glimpsed what looked like a man with bushy hair escaping through the back door and down the steps to the beach. Dr. Sam gave chase, brought down the bushy-haired stranger, but he was again knocked out in the ensuing fight. He came round again as dawn was breaking, lying half in, half out of the lake. He made his way back to the house and phoned a friend, John Spencer Hook, the mayor of Bay Village, yelling, "For God's sake, Spen, come quick! I think they've killed Marilyn." The time was 5:45 a.m. The Hooks lived 100 yards away. It took them 10 minutes to arrive by car. They found Shepard sitting in his ground floor den. He was naked from the waist up and nursing an injured neck. His face was bruised, his trousers wet, and he seemed dazed. Mrs. Hook went up alone to see the body. 7 minutes later, the first police officer arrived. Jack, suppose you're that cop. What would you do?
Well, from my understanding, Mayor Hook, a professional and competent man, had called the police and had stated that Marilyn Sheppard had been murdered. Now, we can assume that the relevant departments were being alerted already and put on standby. The priority for the officer attending is that he or she has enough resources to manage the scene and the witnesses present. I read something about the first officer attending being met by Mayor Hook and Mrs. Hook, that they were reasonably calm. Dr. Sam was sitting on a chair and had minor injuries. The officer was taken to the bedroom where it was clear that Marilyn Sheppard was deceased and had significant head injuries. Now, what the officer needs to do is a quick assessment of what is now clearly a crime scene. Is everyone else in the house accounted for? Now, this would involve a quick check of all the rooms in the house, but it would be just a mental note of anything that looked unusual. And, of course, what condition was Dr. Sam in? And what was he saying?
Yeah, we know that the officer attending asked Dr. Sam what had happened, and he noted that Dr. Sam replied with words to the effect that he didn't know. He'd heard Marilyn scream, that he was fighting on the stairs, that he was in the water, that he came upstairs at this time. He clasped both hands at the back of his neck. Chronologically, it's all very disjointed. Is there anything that strikes you as suspicious or warranting further investigation?
Well, that initial disclosure by Dr. Sam was significant and it needed recording. But all officers know that people under stress behave in different ways. All the officer can do is assess the circumstances and take things logically. Dr. Sam's account was vague in the extreme, but as I've said, people behave differently, and first accounts can be mumbled and incoherent. What does stand out, though, is that he clammed up when he got to the point of having to describe what he saw in the bedroom. Dr. Sam's disclosure wasn't very convincing, but it was the first indication that he was claiming to have disturbed an intruder and that he was trying to find a way to explain why he was wet and had been in the lake at the bottom of the garden. Now that was significant. That crime scene now clearly goes beyond the interior of the house. But, like I've said, this is not the time to get the full story from Dr. Sam. Those officers would balance his first disclosure against their observations. Was there evidence of forced entry? Was anything else disturbed in the house? It's all about scene management. Get the people away from the scene and keep people out.
Thanks, Jack. OK, here's some more information about Sam Shepphard. He was a member of a medical family that was well known in Bayview. Along with his father and two elder brothers, he ran their own hospital, which meant the Shephards had a kind of celebrity status in the Bayview community. They were wealthy and they were influential. A few minutes after that first police officer arrived at Dr. Sam's residence, the first Shepard brother came in, followed closely by the second. They examined Sam, and at 6:30, 3/4 of an hour after the phone call to the mayor, they ushered their younger brother past the gathered police and onto their hospital for treatment. Would you have allowed that, Jack?
The simple answer, no. Dr. Sam was not officially a suspect yet. After all, we're only an hour or so into the investigation. But that scene needed managing professionally. It needed a cordon. Now, from the aerial image I've seen of the house, access is from Lake Road. There's a private driveway through a garden to the house, with a garden extending to the lake at the back. And there are private properties on either side, but they both have extensive gardens. Quite an easy scene to manage. I would expect by modern standards that an officer would restrict any access from where the drive meets Lake Road. First rule, make the cordon as wide as possible. But this was the 1950s, so maybe procedures were less formal. The point is that whether the brothers had asked permission or not, they had no purpose at the scene. Dr. Sam was safe and not seriously hurt. He was part of that crime scene. The mayor was present for legitimate reasons too. The brothers should not have got past the cordon. If they'd been summoned to take care of the boy, then fine. But they didn't need access to the house. The accusations that Sam was spirited away to avoid questioning are valid. So had the police questioned him at this point?
Well, the police did question him at the hospital for 10 minutes at 9 a.m, then for 20 minutes at 11 a.m, and for half an hour at 3 p.m. Is that what you'd expect, Jack, or did Dr. Sam get sanctuary in the hospital?
I wouldn't call it sanctuary, but it bought him more time to develop his story about what had happened. A GP who had examined him on behalf of the coroner said his injuries were superficial. A neurosurgeon, called in later by the family, disagreed with that. Was this a deliberate ploy by the family, or concern for their brother? Maybe a coincidence, maybe a combination of all three. Well, this was a family of high standing in the community. They would want to protect their reputation at all costs. But the brothers had no need to get involved with Dr. Sam's treatment.
Dr. Sam was sedated, and later there were objections to statements he made when he was drowsy being used as evidence. According to the police, one of his brothers interrupted a brief interrogation no fewer than 4 times. Dr. Sam also refused to take a lie detector or truth serum test on the advice, it was claimed, of his lawyers. Now, what do you make of that, Jack?
Well, as a British detective, I never had lie detectors or truth serum available to me. But this was America in the 50s, and some states were using these techniques. Although I think by 1963, the US courts had seen enough of the truth serum option and made their use inadmissible in court. From what I understand, They merely made people more talkative and open to suggestion. Not that dissimilar to the demon drink, alcohol.
The police and the coroner made no secret about being very suspicious of Dr. Sam's story. There were signs of a burglary, drawers pulled out and their contents scattered, his medical bag emptied on the floor. The only other thing missing was a phial of morphine. When he fell asleep on the couch, Dr. Sam was wearing a jacket over a T-shirt. The police found the jacket folded on or by the couch, but there was no sign of the T-shirt. Dr. Sam suggested the killer had pulled it off to replace his own blood-stained shirt. As for other evidence, there were no foreign fingerprints in the house. Is that unusual, Jack?
Not really, but without seeing the crime scene reports, it's not easy to interpret the scene as a whole. I think the term no foreign fingerprints means that all fingerprints have been identified to people with lawful access to the house. And of course it would be unusual for a nighttime burglar to not wear gloves.
OK, there was speculation that Dr. Sam had tried to make it look like a break-in, hence the lack of foreign fingerprints. What do you make of that?
Well, there's a difference between emptying a few drawers and messing the place up a bit to carefully wiping surfaces clean. Even Dr. Sam would be unlikely to have been that composed. But if a blood-stained and deranged burglar had fought with Dr. Sam in order to escape, then fled the scene in a hurry, he might have at least left an impression of his gloves in blood somewhere in the house.
Right. Well, there are some other anomalies. There would have been a hell of a fight with yelling and screaming, but the Shepherd's 7-year-old slept through it all. Also, nobody heard the family dog bark when you'd expect it to. Now, in one of the Sherlock Holmes stories, a watchdog that doesn't bark leads Holmes to conclude that it knew the intruder who stole the racehorse Silver Blaze.
Is there any other point to which you wish to draw my attention, Mr. Holmes?
To the curious incident of the dog in the night time.
But the dog did nothing in the night time.
That is the curious incident.
You see, the dog would have been expected to bark at a stranger, wouldn't it? So, did the shepherd's dog recognise the killer? Was the killer its master? Does any of this constitute evidence?
Not really. It's something a lawyer may throw into the mix at court. But to investigators, that's almost making things up to fill the gaps, and it doesn't carry that much weight. Whoever had killed Marilyn-Sheppard had certainly lost the plot by attacking a defenceless woman as she lay in bed. As for yelling and screaming, I'm not so sure. If it was Dr. Sam, there would have been a build-up, an argument between them, heated words. But that may have been normal. Maybe the Sheppards often argued, but kept their voices down so as not to wake their son. For me, it's more about the evidence about what happened after the assault on her.
Multiple agencies were involved in the Sheppard case. They included the local sheriff, the Cleveland police, the coroner, and the prosecutor's office. It was a complicated investigation that the crime writer Joan Locke describes as haphazard. Reporters soon picked this up, along with a juicy rumour that Dr. Sam was having an affair with a lab technician called Susan Hayes and had recently been to California to see her. Dr. Sam strongly denied this at the inquest into his wife's death. Nevertheless, the Cleveland press stuck by its story with headlines such as "Why isn't Sam Shepphard in jail?" and "Quit stalling, bring him in." On the 30th of July, 26 days after Marilyn was killed, the police charged Dr. Sam with his wife's murder. A federal judge later criticised the media. "If ever there was a trial by newspaper, this is a perfect example," he said. And the most insidious example was the Cleveland press. For some reason, that newspaper took upon itself the role of accuser, judge, and jury.
Time for a sidebar, Your Honour. First, in the United States, the media can say what they like about a criminal suspect. In the UK, the law prohibits the publication of anything that might taint a jury. The criminal offence of strict liability contempt carries a prison sentence. Secondly, in the United States, you have to prove you're innocent. It's the other way round in Great Britain, where the Crown has to prove you're guilty, which is why we journalists report crimes differently in the UK and the US.
I'd also add that whoever was running the Sheppard inquiry, and it's unclear who was, which was part of the problem, seems to have had no public relations support. Nowadays, cases like this are carefully managed by PR specialists who understand crisis handling and know how to deal with the media. There was nothing like that in Bayview in 1954. Anyway, with those points of order on board, let's go back to Dr. Sam's story. The trial drew immense media attention. Joan Locke, and we're indebted to her study of the case, concludes the trial threw up more questions than answers. 1. What was the murder weapon and where was it? The coroner testified that a bloody mark on Marilyn's pillow was the imprint of a surgical instrument used to bludgeon her, but failed to identify the implement. The murder weapon, whatever it was never found. 2. There were very few bloodstains on Dr. Sam's clothes. There was a patch on his trousers, which he said was the result of bending over Marilyn's body to take her pulse, and the prosecution said he'd got rid of his heavily blood-stained T-shirt and probably wasn't wearing trousers anyway. 3. The evidence about the distribution of blood in the master bedroom was confusing. There were only 7 spots outside, which was thought to be a surprisingly light blood trail in the circumstances. The court spent a great deal of time chewing over this evidence. What do you make of it, Jack?
Those issues are conjecture. Sure, there are different interpretations of the scene, but for me, it's the murder weapon, or lack of one with an exhibit label. That's the biggest setback to the prosecution case. I believe the time of death was estimated at 4:30 a.m, so the assault on Marilyn could have been around 4 a.m, with her lying unconscious for some time as life drained from her. So that means Dr. Sam had an hour at least before he rang the mayor. You can do a lot in an hour, and he's got a huge lake at the bottom of his garden. I'm not suggesting he took a rowing boat out into the middle of the lake, but he did get wet from being at the lake's edge, allegedly fighting with the killer the second time. Dr. Sam had plenty of time to dispose of the weapon and the T-shirt. To be fair, he had time to go for a swim and clean off all that blood too. That lake was very useful to whoever killed Marilyn Sheppard. The question is, how much of the lake was searched and how thoroughly? Simon, did you see that image of the group of local boys wading in the lake, searching for the weapon?
Yes, I did. They were local volunteers, weren't they, under supervision? And to be fair, they looked cold and uninspired.
They did. And if that represents the resolve of investigators to find the weapon, no wonder it wasn't found. Whether it was Dr. Sam or a bushy-haired burglar, chances are that weapon had been hurled as far as possible into the lake, and that could have been done, 100 metres away from the Sheppard's home, maybe more.
OK, let's say the jurors are bored witless by the endless to and fro over a few spots of blood and what they might mean. Things are about to hot up. The prosecution produces Susan Hayes, you remember, the other woman with whom Dr. Sam had denied having an affair. She was 24, slim, suntanned, and took the witness stand wearing what one reporter described as the standard wardrobe for females in murder trials, to wit, a demure black dress with a prim white Peter Pan collar. She told the court that she and Dr. Sam had been having an affair for a year and a half. They started seeing each other when she was working at the Bayview Hospital. Susan moved to California several months before the murder, but Dr. Sam went to see her when he attended an osteopathic convention. Dr. Sam claimed Susan had told her that he was considering a divorce, which the accused man vigorously denied. He did, however, confess to other extramarital affairs, but said he'd always told his wife about them. He also said that Marilyn and he were having sexual problems, or as he put it, Marilyn had gone off sex after the birth of their son, which was his justification for having a fling with Susan and a number of other unnamed women. Basically, he goes jumping into bed with half the neighbourhood and the nursing staff. Well, that's going to make Marilyn feel a whole lot better about their relationship, isn't it? So, what do we think? Did Dr. Sam murder Marilyn so that he could be with Susan Haynes? Pip, ladies first, you have 1 minute, starting now.
OK, bearing in mind I am not police trained, too many things just sound off to me here. No foreign fingerprints. So, could a frenzied killing like that be really committed by someone with a calm presence of mind to not leave behind evidence? Where was the murder weapon? And I struggle to believe that Dr. Sam's T-shirt was taken from his body by the killer. No, it sounds like a crime of passion, with the perpetrator carefully manipulating and disposing of evidence. With marital issues and a lover on the side, I'm not convinced of his innocence, put it that way.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Jack's next. Jack, did Dr. Sam murder his wife? Your minute starts now.
Dr. Sam murdered his wife after an argument over his latest extramarital affair and the end of his relationship. He was probably a controlling individual who was bored with his marriage but didn't like the idea of his impeccable reputation being ruined by his pregnant wife going public with a separation and divorce. She told him that their big Independence Day party was off, his life was being turned upside down. In a controlled rage, he lost the plot and beat her to death. Having calmed down, his own survival instincts kicked in, and he made up the bushy-haired burglar.
OK, well, I bet you want to know what happened in court, don't you? Well, the trial lasted 9 weeks. The jury was out for a further 5 days before they found Dr. Sam not guilty of first-degree murder. However, they did find him guilty of murder in the second degree. This meant he was no longer a candidate for the electric chair. He was sentenced to life imprisonment instead, which meant it would be 10 years before he was considered for parole. However, it didn't stop there, and Pip's going to take the story from here.
The fight to free Dr. Sam Shepphard turned into a long-running saga that inspired a number of books, movies and TV series. The Fugitive has been cited as being loosely based on Shepard's fight to clear his name, although this claim has always been denied by the creators. So our story is turning into more of an escape room than a murder mystery. Shepard spent 3 years in Ohio State Penitentiary before there was a new twist. Another man confessed to the murder. 23-year-old Donald Wedler, who was in prison in Florida, told the authorities that on the night of the 3rd of July 1954, he was doped up on heroin, had stolen a car, drove to Bay Village, broken into the Sheppard residence, and bludgeoned Marilyn to death. He was, he said, the bushy-haired intruder that Sam Shepphard had chased onto the beach. At the trial, 2 defence witnesses said they'd seen a bushy-haired man lurking near the house that night, but their testimony was cast into doubt because the Sheppards had offered a $10,000 reward for information. Either way, Wedler took a lie detector test. The polygraph operator concluded that either Wedler had committed the crime or sincerely believed that he had. Jack, as a former major crime detective, what do you make of this? Does it cast doubt on Shepard's conviction?
Well, we covered false confessions in an earlier episode, didn't we? Believe it or not, they are fairly frequent and often bizarre. The point is, no confession stands without corroboration.
Well, in the event, Shepard's hopes of clearing his name were dashed. The Cleveland police found discrepancies between Wedler's story and Dr. Sam's version that convinced them the confession was a hoax. Dr. Sam's attorney, William Corrigan, spent 6 years making appeals, but all were rejected. Corrigan died in 1961 and F. Lee Bailey took over as chief counsel. Bailey's petition for a writ of habeas corpus was granted in 1964 by a United States District Court judge. The state of Ohio was ordered to bring the prisoner to court and show that his detention was lawful. The judge called the 1954 trial a mockery of justice that shredded Sheppard's 14th Amendment right to due process. The state was ordered to release Sheppard on bond. The state then appealed the ruling to the US Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit, which in 1965 reversed the federal judge's ruling. Bailey appealed to the US Supreme Court, which agreed to hear the case in Shepard versus Maxwell. On June 6, 1966, the Supreme Court, by an 8-1 vote, struck down the murder conviction. The decision noted, among other factors, that a carnival atmosphere had permeated the trial, and that the trial judge, Edward J. Blythen, was biased against Sheppard. Blythen, among other transgressions, told a reporter shortly before the trial started, "Well, he's guilty as hell. There's no question about it." Bailey did eventually get Sheppard out, but only after he'd served 10 years and was eligible for parole consideration anyway. 3 days after his release in 1964, Sheppard married Ariane Teben-Johann, a German divorcee who'd corresponded with him during his imprisonment. The two had been engaged since January 1963.
So, if I've got this straight, Sheppard was released on parole in July 64 and remarried. It looked like his conviction was overturned, but in 65 a higher court ruled otherwise, and then in 1966 the Supreme Court cleared his name.
Well, you're partly right. There were further delays before. On the 16th of November, 66, more than 12 years after Marilyn Sheppard's murder, a second Cleveland jury found her husband not guilty. That verdict, Joan Locke tells us, seems to have been wholly or largely based on apparent discrepancies in police and forensic evidence. Jack, does that surprise you?
Well, no. The police investigation is what it is. The decisions made at the time and the actions taken cannot be changed, so any lawyer, often acting pro bono, may fancy a go at finding holes in the original investigation and finding new information to challenge things.
There was the criminalist named Dr. Paul Kirk, wasn't there?
That's right. He published a report concluding that, wait for it, the murderer was left-handed. Well, that nicely explains the bruising to the right side of Dr. Sam's face, bruising which, if self-inflicted, would confirm that Dr. Sam was right-handed. Dr. Kirk also suggested the murder weapon was probably a flashlight. The prosecution had suggested, from the interpretation of bloodstain marks on the bed, that it was a surgical instrument. Dr. Kirk's next revelation was that the killer was most likely someone who hated the Sheppards. Well, I've not read anything that supports that, and not wanting to give it credibility, but if it was, then why did Dr. Sam get off so lightly? He reported finding blood in the murder room that came from neither Sam nor from Marilyn, and I'm not sure what techniques were used in 1954, but if any house is forensically examined for blood, other traces will be found. Oh, and guess what happened in July 1955, 3 months after Kirk's report was published? A swimmer who lived next to the Sheppard home found a dented flashlight in the shallow water of Lake Eerie. Of course, this takes us back to the original search of the lake. If that area had been systematically searched, then the flashlight must have been discarded well after the murder. I wouldn't want to even suggest that the discovery of the flashlight was convenient.
Well, with all those additional theories and information, his acquittal in 1966 meant that Dr. Sam was a free man in every sense of the word, but he was heavily in debt to F. Lee Bailey. It took a long time to get his medical license back. Then, within a year of reinstatement, he was named in a negligence suit and asked to resign from the hospital where he was working. Ariane sued for divorce and obtained a restraining order, claiming Sheppard had often threatened her. She complained that he frequently carried a pistol, knives, and a hatchet and was subject to extreme mood swings. Finally, he had a new girlfriend and had lost interest in her. Any alarm bells ringing for you, Jack?
Sure. It seems behind closed doors to the women in his life, Dr. Sam was a nasty piece of work.
Dr. Sam couldn't practice surgery, so he set up as a GP. But he had another string to his bow. The father of Colleen Strickland, the girlfriend mentioned in the divorce papers, was a professional wrestler. And before long, Killer Sam Shepphard made his debut in the ring. Shepard, who'd always been a keep fit fanatic, wrestled over 40 matches, including a number of tag team bouts with Strickland as his partner. His notoriety made him a strong draw, and he used his anatomical knowledge to develop a new submission hold, the mandible claw. He married Colleen. She was only 19, but they were very happy until, in April 1970, Dr. Sam suddenly collapsed and refused to allow his in-laws to call a doctor. His death was ascribed to liver failure, possibly due to heavy drinking.
And there, the story would end, if it were not for two other developments that have occurred since the main actors passed away. Firstly, there's the question of Marilyn Sheppard's unborn baby. You remember Sheppard's son, Samuel Reese, known as Chip? Well, he was determined to clear his father's name once and for all. In 1999, he and Alan Davis, a lifelong friend of Sheppard and administrator of his estate, sued the state of Ohio for Sheppard's wrongful imprisonment. In the course of the civil trial for wrongful imprisonment, Marilyn Sheppard's body was exhumed. She'd been in the early stages of pregnancy, and tests were done to see if Sheppard had been the father of her baby. Terry Gilbert, an attorney retained by the Sheppard family, told the media that, and I quote, "the fetus in this case had previously been autopsied," unquote, a fact that had never previously been disclosed. This, Sheppard argued, raised questions about the coroner's office in the original case possibly concealing pertinent evidence. If Sam Shepphard wasn't the father, there was a motive for murder. But due to the passage of time, in 1999, it was impossible to establish who the unborn baby's father was. What's your view, Jack? Was it a motive for murder?
Well, disclosure of case material was less structured back in the 1950s. But I'm not buying that the examination of the fetus was deliberately hidden. The autopsy report was unused material that had no bearing on the case. Any examination would have been to ascertain the cause of death. Blood may, I suppose, have been taken from the unborn child, but not for paternity, unless, of course, this was raised as an issue, and it wasn't. No one was questioning whether Marilyn was in another relationship, were they? The blood type of the fetus could only have revealed that Dr. Sam wasn't the father. If Dr. Sam had suspected the child wasn't his, that wouldn't remove his motive anyway.
And then in 1959, detectives questioned Richard Abeling, a handyman and window cleaner, about various burglaries in the Bayview area. They recovered various stolen items, including 2 rings that belonged to Marilyn Sheppard. Abeling's blood was type A, and a spot of type A blood was found on the closet door in Marilyn's bedroom. Dr. Sam and his wife both had type O blood, so at the very least there was evidence of a third person at the murder scene. Though, as Jack mentioned, the mere presence of blood doesn't guarantee when it was left there. When questioned about this, Abeling said he'd cut his finger while cleaning the Sheppard's windows. The forensic evidence had been preserved, so it was possible to analyse the DNA in the type A blood. A plaintiff DNA expert was 90% confident that one of the blood spots belonged to Richard Abeling, but according to the rules of the court, this wasn't admissible. In 1984, Richard Abeling was convicted of murdering Ethel May Durkin, an elderly widow he was supposed to be looking after as a care assistant. Abeling denied any criminal involvement in the murder of Marilyn Sheppard, but Kathy Wagner-Dial, who worked with him caring for Ethel May Durkin, testified Abeling had confessed to her in 1983. A fellow convict also reported that Abeling confessed to the Sheppard murder. The defence called into question the credibility of both these witnesses during the civil trial. Now, Ebeling died in prison in 1998, where he was serving life for Ethel May Durkin's murder. OK, Jack, what's this new evidence telling you? Who murdered Marilyn Sheppard?
I'm not swayed by the window cleaner theory. Whilst I've not seen it in detail, we must be really careful with confessions to third parties. They're often veiled or come from misinterpreted comments. The later DNA must have been discredited too. And remember, in 1959, Ebeling was lied to by the police, who claimed his blood had been found. Now, if Ebeling was of low intellect, he probably felt the need to explain it. I'm not seeing anything that reliably makes Ebeling a serious suspect, so I'm sticking with this. Dr. Sam murdered Marilyn Sheppard.
Well, there you have it. A shocking true crime story that remains more or less unsolved and maybe unsolvable. Who do you think murdered Marilyn? Let us know on Twitter. Our handle is @PsychoKillerPO. That's all one word. @PsychoKillerPO.
And if you enjoyed our podcast, head over to buymeacoffee.com and search for Psycho Pals. That's all one word, Psycho Pals. We will see you again soon on the dark side for another Psycho Killer shocking true crime story.